All right, so why don't we go ahead and get started, Matt, if that's okay with you. Thanks to everyone who has joined us today. We appreciate you being on. I know your time is valuable, and we're grateful that you're with us. We're going to go over what we know currently about Paraquat and talk about why we think it's a pretty good project and why you should consider it. I would say at the outset, just in kind of a summary fashion, we are going to be heavily involved in Paraquat. It's not Roundup 2.0, but I do think it is a good project with good prospects. The details we'll go over with Matt in just a moment, and what I've found to be the case for other webinars that I've done. It really doesn't do a whole lot of good for me to talk at length in the beginning. As we get into the meat of the case and the details, then the questions seem to pop up, and we answer those in a Q&A format as they occur. And so with that being said, why don't we get started with Matt Pettit?
Thanks, guys, for joining and taking time out of your schedule to join the webinar. Let me just go ahead and share my screen real quick. And we'll get started with the presentation. So like Ron said, today we're going to be going over Paraquat, and I am one of the attorneys leading up Beasley Allen's Paraquat litigation. Here's the rest of the team. For anyone on this slide, if you have any questions for Paraquat, I'll be happy to answer them. My email is matt.pettit, P-E-T-T-I-T, at beasleyallen.com. If you have any intake questions, anything like that, we'll be more than happy to answer. So today, I'll be going over a brief history of Paraquat, including its primary uses, its connection to Parkinson's disease, potential legal concerns, litigation status update, and information on case screening. At the outset, like Ron said, it's very important to know that this isn't Roundup 2.0. Paraquat usage is smaller compared to Roundup usage, so we expect a smaller class of potential clients. So Paraquat is a highly toxic herbicide that is non-selective. Unlike other herbicides, Paraquat will kill any foliage that it comes into contact with. Interestingly enough, Paraquat was used by the US government in the 60s to eradicate poppy and marijuana fields in Mexico. So it's a pretty lethal herbicide. A key difference between Paraquat and other herbicides is that Paraquat is a restricted use pesticide, meaning that Paraquat is only available for purchase by an individual who has a license, and the licensing is controlled through the EPA. The herbicide is not as widely available as, say, Roundup or other products that can be picked up at your local hardware store. And, as such, because it is so highly toxic, 32 countries, including China, have banned the use of Paraquat. Paraquat became commercially available in 1964 in the United States. And one thing to keep in mind when you're discussing with a potential client whether or not they've had Paraquat exposure, Paraquat is dyed a very vibrant blue and has an odor additive to avoid any kind of unintentional consumption. We found that these can help weed out non-related cases. For a lot of what we've seen is farmers may not remember the specific brand of Paraquat that they used, but they distinctly remember using Paraquat from the color and the odor. So those are kind of good screening questions. Even though it's a restricted use herbicide, Paraquat is heavily used within its industry. As you can see from this graph, its use has been consistently on the rise. A lot of people are speculating that this is because its plants are becoming resistant to Roundup, and this is an alternative to that. As you can see, there are many different name brands of Paraquat. Gramaxamone is one of the most popular, and it's made by Syngenta, who we'll get into in a little bit. Paraquat's primary use is on soybeans, corn, and cotton, and it's very heavily used in California in the wine industry on the grapes. So Paraquat has been linked to Parkinson's disease, and Parkinson's disease is a progressive neurodegenerative disorder of the brain that affects primarily the motor system, or the part of the central nervous system that controls movement. Less than 10% of Parkinson cases are caused by a genetic mutation alone. Scientists who study Parkinson's disease agree that more than 90% of the cases are caused by a combination of environmental factors, genetic susceptibility, and the aging process. The characteristic symptoms of Parkinson's disease are resting tremors, which is shaking movements when the muscles are relaxed, slowness in the voluntary movement and reflexes, stiffness and resistance to passive movement, and impaired balance. At a basic level, Paraquat causes the production of too much oxygen in the cells. This is called oxidative stress, and neurons in the brain are vulnerable to this oxidative stress. Specifically, the selective degeneration and death of dopamine-producing nerve cells in the part of the brain called the SNPC is one of the primary hallmarks of Parkinson's disease. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is critical to the brain's control of motor function. So the death of these dopamine-producing neurons in the SNPC of the brain decreases the production of dopamine. Once that dopamine-producing neurons have died, they are not replaced. And when enough dopamine-producing neurons have died, dopamine production falls below the level that the brain requires for proper control of motor function. And this results in the motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Dopamine-producing neurons are particularly susceptible to oxidative stress, and the epidemiological support is stronger for Paraquat than the epidemiological support showing that Roundup causes harm. There's an increased risk in the epi studies that ranges from 1.4 to 1.8 if you've ever used the product, and then 1.99 to 3.4 with higher use. But there are other studies that show a much larger increase in the risk. It can be up to 6.44 with higher use. The American Journal of Epidemiology, I'm sorry guys, Journal of the American Medical Association, and the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences are just a few of these sources that have published research pointing to a link between Paraquat and Parkinson's disease. And with that out of the way, there are a few legal issues to be concerned about in the case. As you can see on the slide, the main defendants who have been identified in the litigation so far are Syngenta, its related entities, and then Chevron. Syngenta has gone through a few iterations. Syngenta Crop Protection LLC is the domestic arm, while Syngenta AG is a Swiss-based parent company. The current company started when 4 British companies merged in 1926 to create the Imperial Chemical Industries, or ICI. ICI claims to have discovered Paraquat in 1955. Syngenta is now the leading manufacturer of Paraquat. Chevron received the rights to sell Paraquat in or around 1964 in the United States when it became available. If you want more information on the history of these companies, you can pull one of our recently filed cases. It's Rutherford v. Syngenta Crop Protection at 221-CV-611 in the Northern District of Alabama. Because of their history with developing and first introducing Paraquat, that's why these defendants have been identified and pursued in the litigation up till now. Another main concern is preemption. The federal law to worry about is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, which regulates the labeling and packaging of herbicides such as Paraquat. However, there is a savings clause within the statute that we believe will allow these cases to go forward under a state tort theory. The savings clause states that the pesticide is misbranded if its labeling bears any statement, design, or graphic representation relative thereto its ingredients, which is false or misleading in any particular way. So these cases will be insufficient warning theory more so than a no warning at all theory, as there are warnings on Paraquat. Bates versus Dow, United States Supreme Court case 544 U.S. 431 in 2005 supports this position. Essentially, the Supreme Court ruled that FIFRA only prohibits state law labeling and packaging requirements that are in addition to or different from what is called for under FIFA. And a state law labeling requirement is not preempted if it is equivalent to and fully consistent with FIFA's misbranding provision. So in this case, pleading will be key. Another potential issue that we're seeing is that Paraquat requires a surfactant to be mixed in with it. So these surfactants are generally mixed in by the end user and not the manufacturer. So defendants in some cases that are further along have pointed to this issue as a defense. And speaking of those other cases, there are cases in both state and federal courts. More cases are being filed in federal courts at the moment, but states such as Pennsylvania and Missouri and Illinois have seen their fair share of state filings. For state litigation, there are two major developments underway. The first is that there is a JCCP, or California state equivalent to the MDL process, that is being formed. The second is that there is a state case pending in St. Clair County, Illinois right now with these defendants. It started a bench trial this past week, and the trial focuses exclusively on the consumer fraud aspect. Now, for federal litigation, a motion to consolidate / transfer was filed with the panel on multi-district litigation, and the panel has set oral arguments in Washington, D.C. on May 27th. You can watch this remotely if you please. The details for access are on the JPML's site. At these oral arguments, there are several locations that are being suggested for consolidation, including the Southern District of Illinois, the Northern District of California, the Northern District of Mississippi, Eastern District of Missouri, District of Minnesota, and the Northern District of Alabama. Beasley Allen is looking for cases of both diagnosed Parkinson's disease and Parkinson's disease-like symptoms. One of these reasons is that it can take a while to get a confirmed Parkinson's disease confirmation. And if clients are exhibiting the symptoms, we're encouraging them to go ahead and try to get an expedited diagnosis. What we are looking for is the type of exposure. So mainly that is commercial versus residential. When we say residential, we mean more secondary exposure, because like we said, the primary exposure is going to be those people who work on industrial farms who are buying it with their license and then spraying it onto their crops. But people who live around industrial farms can get overspray from the farming communities around them. So because of that, we're also looking for the location of the property, the acreage of the property, whether the claimant has been prescribed dopamine promoting medication, or if they've had any kind of other exposure to other chemicals such as TCE or Agent Orange. We're also trying to screen for a family history of Parkinson's disease and whether or not the claimant was exposed in multiple states, because the exposure for the state will be critical. Some states, such as Texas, have a far higher process for the causes of actions than other states. That's one thing to keep in mind. The main issues that we've been seeing so far is that many of the applicators of Paraquat are coming forward, but not the purchasers of Paraquat. Many of these people don't recall or simply cannot provide any kind of support for a restricted use permit, and they were essentially told by someone to go spray. So because of this, we're looking at both primary and secondary exposure at this point in time. And if those people who lived on or around a farm were exposed to Paraquat and have also experienced development of Parkinson's disease, we're considering those cases. Parkinson's disease takes some time to form, so most clients will be older. So this last slide is just a breakdown of the referral rates. If you have just a lead alone, Beasley Allen will do a 20% for the lead, and if you have signed cases with complete packets, it'll be 33%. And just a few last minute thoughts on Paraquat. So there are about 60,000 Parkinson's disease diagnoses in the US annually, and about 1 million currently have been diagnosed. 90% of those cases have been described as idiopathic, and 10% seem to have a genetic predisposition. There is currently a bill being proposed to ban paraquat use and purchase in the United States. It was originally proposed in 2019, I believe, but there has not been much action on the bill since. The Michael J. Fox Foundation is also an active voice against paraquat, and they're very involved in the media to try to bring awareness to it. And I think that is it for me. So we can open up the floor to some questions and answer any kind of questions. So I'll just pause my screen. And we'll look at this Q&A that we have.
So we can see some of the questions coming in now. Matt, I'm not sure if you can see them all. I can. And so why don't we just start doing the best we can with the questions. So one is, if someone lives near a farm, how do you find out if the farm used Paraquat? Normally, you can talk with people who were associated with that farm or with that use. As Matt pointed out, there's a distinct odor. There's normally a blue dye, and you would know from that sort of questioning with the potential client. Yes, we can email you the PowerPoint that we use today. That's no problem. Another question coming in is, does predisposition to Parkinson's disease disqualify a potential inquiry? Not necessarily. We are looking, as Matt mentioned, for certain markers. Significant Agent Orange exposure would be a marker in the negative for taking the case on, but we don't have any set criteria. It would depend on the extent of the predisposition. And I'm just looking at these as they come in. Preemption concerns. There are always preemption concerns in any mass tort now, whether it be in the pharmaceutical realm or the herbicide realm. I was reading the Hardiman opinion last week. I think it came out on Friday. And if you have not read that, there's an excellent discussion from the Ninth Circuit on why preemption did not apply in that case, and why we do not think that it will apply here. But as Matt pointed out during the presentation, it's always a very sensitive pleading issue, and there certainly is a growing cry from defendants for preemption. Of course, it's always been there, but we think we'll be okay in that regard. I see a question from my good friend Christopher. Damage to lungs and other organs. Are you taking cases of other injuries associated with paraquat exposure? Yes and no there. We are not actively taking cases for anything but Parkinson's or Parkinson's symptoms at the moment, but there are consultants and experts that we have been talking to who are looking into the other injuries portion. I'm not confident enough to say that we'll take those on yet, but we are looking, and there are some physicians, in fact, that we've spoken to who feel quite strongly about other issues, but I'm not ready to go there yet. You mentioned end users who mix the Paraquat. It sounds like those may be additional defendants. Who are those end users? As to other defendants, there certainly may be some, depending on the facts of the case. In Roundup, for instance, there were, efforts to name local defendants. A lot of those were unsuccessful, and a lot of those cases got removed. And pulled in and tagged in the MDL. I think we would just look at that on a case-by-case basis. If there was a strong enough connection in case, we would be happy to include a local defendant. And as Matt mentioned, there will be state court litigation regardless. And so we'll also analyze which states are actively, actively have state court cases and where we might can do work there. And Matt Pettit, if you feel free to dive in here, I'm just I'm reading them as best I can and answering them. Did you see the one Matt Munson sent us regarding the studies for people who live around areas where the products were used versus those directly exposed?
No, well, I'm seeing it right now. The studies that we've been reading have been focusing primarily on direct exposure and the link to Parkinson's disease. There is some literature discussing the secondary exposure. So there's some on both. Like I said, there's 3 or 4 different journals right now that are being pretty proactive with this information, trying to publish related studies. I'm seeing another question: how is Paraquat applied? It's applied like any kind of herbicide. It's been done with a crop duster, backpacks, put on the back of spraying rigs on tractors. So it can be applied in numerous different ways. Let's see, I'm seeing another one that is, what's crops is it used on? Soybeans, grapes, cotton, corn, a lot of those industrial ones. There's a specific slide on this PowerPoint that gives a more in-depth analysis of what is being used on and the amount that is being used. And so we can forward this PowerPoint around and you'll have that information. The next one is asking how much proof of use do we need to send you the case. At this point, we are looking and fielding all potential cases. If a claimant is can identify whether it was Paraquat or something along those lines, then we're interested in talking with them, especially if they have Parkinson's disease or Parkinson-like symptoms. So at this point, if they're saying that they have it and y'all want to send the case, we'd be happy to go through a more thorough process to see.
Yeah, and let me add in there, Matt, we're probably being a little more liberal right now regarding proof of exposure because of you can tell from the nature of the questions that are coming in. Maybe you were in a field working and you were getting sprayed regularly. Maybe you were actually applying it. There could be various scenarios where exposure could take place over a period of time. We're trying our best to link the Parkinson's diagnosis or the Parkinson's-like symptoms to the exposure. So we don't have a set criteria at this point regarding length. We're trying to look at the cases as they come in and see what we find out. So I'm trying really hard not to have, hey, you got to have, this is hypothetical, of course, 10 weeks and you only have 9. We're trying to look at it based on the facts we see. And then, Matt, you see the proof of use documents. Obviously, if you have, if you're an applicator or you have a license, we'd love to see that. That would be very helpful. In lieu of that, if they're, working in the field, we're trying to gather whatever information we can regarding proof of working, in that field, in that area. And Matt, you may have other things to add to that.
No, I think that sums that up. And then I'm seeing one that's asking about this attendee saying, I've seen there are exposure cases as opposed to applicator cases from the 60s where they worked in the fields and were literally crop dusted on. How do you work up evidence on these older claims? So like Ron said, at this point, we're being liberal with talking with clients and seeing their history. A lot of what we have seen so far are people who were working in the fields and may not necessarily know what they were exposed to, but they were exposed to something. And so if they have a Parkinson's diagnosis, we're talking with those cases, and we're just moving down the road with those. Another question is asking if there's any hotspots that you can target the cases for. So I'm going to resume sharing my screen, and you can see on this chart graph, there are a lot of hotspots. That's the darker areas. I know this area right here in California is one of the highest users of Paraquat. And then I believe it goes down to Mississippi and then somewhere in this Midwest region. So those are some hot spots that you can try to target some ads for to see if you can get some farmers. Let me pause that.
Right. And Matt, while you're there, then of course, I think the map is a great indicator of hotspots, heavy areas of use. Just a reminder, all the slides that were used today will be available to you, as will a recording of this webinar in case you want to go back and look at any aspect of it. Back to questions. We don't really have a minimum level of proof for exposure. Again, we're trying to be very diligent in talking to these potential clients and getting a feel for what their exposure was, and then wed that to whatever symptoms they have or diagnosis. And we're using the two of those to make our decision. Yes, we do assist in finding proof of exposure. Again, whether it be a lead or a completed packet, we have a team who's dedicated to gathering all the details on these claims so that we can work them up and get them prepared for filing. So we are able to help there.
And let's see, is the odor present post-application if a potential client mentions it, but you cannot confirm that neighbor's farm used it? Yeah, it's the odor is there pre and post-application. From what we've been hearing, talking with clients, it's a very visceral smell, and it's hard to forget. So if people were crop dusted on and were exposed to that on their skin, they could or should have some kind of memory of that odorous smell.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here, Matt. Minimum latency period. We do not have a set minimum latency at this moment, but we are aware that literature and consultants indicate that there is a latency period. So we are factoring that in, and we are trying to build strong cases, but I'm reluctant, again, at this point, to set a minimum, because someone could be close to the line of whatever that is. And we would want to be liberal in the beginning as to what that latency period was. It would probably depend somewhat on exposure and the symptoms that were being exhibited. But yes, we do, do understand and are aware that there is a latency period from exposure to symptomatic or the diagnosis of Parkinson's.
The next one I'm saying is there an analytical test which can detect Paraquat in a person's blood, or a test which can demonstrate exposure? To my knowledge, there is not. If I'm wrong, I would gladly be wrong, but that's not something that we have seen so far.
Yeah. Go ahead, Matt. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And then another one is, are you able to get a list of all those who got licensed to use Paraquat? And yes, that's something that we are currently working on. We're trying to find the best method to get this, because that'll be a key piece in discovery for this case, especially working it up for a secondary exposure who may have lived around a farm who used Paraquat.
That's accurate.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Upon signing a client, how would you begin discovery from the farm/field that the person worked in? Most of the time, the farm field is family owned and they are unwilling to participate on willfully giving over their inventory, showing that Paraquat was used for liability reasons. Ron, I think that kind of goes to the question before about getting a potential list of Paraquat users who are registered. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would. And I think that will be part of the dynamic. I think the second part of that will be speaking with the person who has the symptoms regarding length of exposure, where they were, what field they were in, what part of the country. Obviously, the heat map that we're looking at is not, the answer. But if you look at the map and you can see it on the screen now, I think, if you're in an area that has relatively low use, that would you'd naturally question that. If you're in an area where it's just red hot, that's also a factor. So I think we take both of those and work together to try to build the exposure case. And then I see what is considered low versus high. Again, the facts are the facts, but if you have a Parkinson's or symptoms case, you would prefer to see as long an exposure as possible, again, assuming a reasonable latency period with it. So we're not having any sort of, I mean, obviously, a day or two a week, that's not gonna cut it in most circumstances. But we don't have any formal cutoff for exposure.
Yeah, and just for a reference to this Paraquat's so toxic that a vomiting agent is also added for any kind of unintentional consumption. And so up to a teaspoon can be deadly if consumed. So it's pretty dangerous stuff.
And I'm probably going out of order here, but we do have packets and checklists that we use for intake. We'll be happy to share those. We are continuing to, there's an evolution of it of sorts. As we gather more information, we also work on the checklist, but yes, we do have packets. We do have checklists that we're using currently, and we will be glad to share those with you.
And regarding the secondary exposure, have there been many clients with seepage or runoff from the next door neighbor? We are seeing a fair share of those. Like I said, the highest volume of clients that we're seeing are people who either worked on farms as employees or they were the direct farm owners. We have gotten some cases from people who lived in a very agriculture heavy area and were exposed to spraying. So it is a good mix.
I'll take the post-mortem recoveries. Generally, we're trying to stay away from that for now. I'm not saying that it can't be done, but it is more complicated and it would depend on the facts. But as a general rule, we are trying to stay away from that area as we speak.
I'm seeing a couple questions asking about a specific detailing on what this stuff smells like. And I have not used it firsthand. I've just been reading about it. And all I've been reading about is that it's just a very pungent smell. I haven't heard any kind of descriptions about whether or not it's, smells like a fish or anything like that. I've just been reading that's a very, very strong odor. It's not something that could be ignored.
Yeah, and that's kind of the same thing I've been getting, Matt, is that when you talk to people and they've had some exposure, I don't know that I've ever heard them say, hey, it's like a skunk or like this or like that, but they all indicate that it's a very strong, recognizable odor that's, not present when you have, other forms of herbicide. And I'm sorry that I'm not given a better description than that, but most people you talk to, I think, will say, hey, it's obvious. I mean, it's a very strong odor. SOL, we are most states, and again, this is a very general description, and Matt may correct me. Most states, you have to link the condition to what actually caused it. So you're not really going to, it'll be similar to Roundup in that sense. You're not going to have a statute issued in most places because the science is developing as to the idea that paraquat exposure can cause Parkinson's. So for most states, that's not going to be an issue. There are some states that at least attempt to run off the date of diagnosis. And then you get into a question of, do you have a formal diagnosis of Parkinson's, or do you just have symptoms, and what would be the trigger date? We're being liberal in that regard at the moment. So, that's kind of where we are on that. I don't know, Matt, you may want to add something to that.
No, I agree with that. I'm seeing another question asking to repeat the information for the filed Alabama case. And I just put that information in the chat so you can see it. It's 221-CV-611 Rutherford v. Syngenta Corp., Northern District of Alabama. So there's that information. I'm seeing another question. It seems a tough proximate cause issue. So can you comment? That's one issue that we're looking into very heavily. Like Ron was just saying, it's another one of those situations where the science is catching up with the litigation itself. I would say from what I've seen, Parkinson's has been linked to paraquat usage since around the 90s to some varying degree. So after talking with some experts, they are feeling very confident about the link between these two. And so they are providing literature and stuff that is supporting those decisions.
Yeah, and so I would answer it this way, Matt. This is not Roundup, obviously, but when you talk to certain consultants, several of them feel like the link between paraquat and Parkinson's is stronger than Roundup, i.e. glyphosate and NHL. Okay, great. That doesn't mean the causation case is going to be easy. One of the things that we're doing right now is talking to multiple experts, and I see the question which. I'm reluctant to list them all at the moment, but suffice to say, we are trying to build a strong causation case because that's going to be at the center of whatever happens here. There will be various degrees of exposure. And so we are looking to build the strongest case that we can regarding causation. But no doubt, causation will be hotly contested, as it was and is in Roundup and in really any herbicide case. But that'll be a hotly contested issue. Wouldn't a place to look be workers' comp cases? I think that's a fair assumption. And that would be a place you could check, again, making sure that you have the caveats regarding the Parkinson's-like symptoms and, the exposure of paraquat, either as a licensed applicator or in a field with perhaps secondary exposure. Are you seeing a lot of cases that are disqualified based on the statutes of repose? I don't know that I would say a lot, but repose is something that you do have to consider. But I don't think I would characterize it as a lot now. Matt, on the proximate cause confounders, I know Agent Orange is an issue, TCE is an issue. Are there others you'd like to talk about?
Those are the main ones that we're looking for. And like I said from the slideshow, one of the primary concerns is whether or not there's a family history of Parkinson's disease, because largely this can be a genetic thing. So if it's in the family already, then that is one factor that we're looking at to potentially weed out those cases.
Right. And I think there are many lawyers who have handled this type of case many times on our webinar today. And as most of us know, you start with one client and their medical records and their medical history. And you basically start with kind of a differential diagnosis type approach, and you're looking at that client and you're basically ruling out other causes. So this, we could probably do a whole nother webinar on causation, and some people would be excited, some people would be bored, but that's the basic process when you start with any client. So you're trying to build your from the center, you're trying to build your strongest causation cases as soon as you can. I'm just kind of stating the obvious there. Which jurisdiction are we filing? We filed a case in the Northern District of Alabama. We wanted to suggest a particular Northern District judge for the MDL process. And so we are watching, probably like most people, we're watching the JPML, and we'll be, present virtually at the hearing on the 27th. We are probably waiting to see a little bit about what happens there and where the MDL goes. That will have some influence on where we file our cases. What state court venues become attractive or heavier will also be a factor there. So we are considering multiple options depending on what happens at the JPML, and of course where the client was exposed and lives.
Let's see, I'm saying, what percentage of your cases are you getting that have confirmation that Paraquat was used? I would say the vast majority of our cases, the individual was either the direct purchaser or was working on a small enough farm to where they can confirm that it was Paraquat. Maybe not necessarily the specific brand, but I would say the majority of the cases are confirmed Paraquat exposure. Someone's asking if there are other chemical or environmental exposures that can cause a client problems in these claims. I think we lightly touched on those. Once again, that would be kind of Agent Orange exposure, TCE exposure. And I think that's where we've been landing on those so far for our intake purposes.
Yeah, and again, we're talking with consultants daily who are helping us to refine what is a legitimate concern in the way of a confounder and what is not. And we are overlaying that with our interviews and our discussions with potential clients to make sure we have the best situation going forward.
What kind of doctors make the Parkinson's diagnosis? Yes, from what we're saying, it's primarily either a neurologist, if they're referred to go to one, or it could be the general doctor. A lot of these people are either have Parkinson-like symptoms or the actual diagnosed one, and the diagnosed one we're seeing from neurologists. So it's a little bit of a mixture between those two. It's not like Roundup where you'll have a oncology report that will be able to confirm it.
Right, and I would add also that from what we've seen thus far, and I think this is fairly common, misdiagnosis or late diagnosis is, I don't know if I want to say common, but it does happen in the Parkinson's area. So you have certain base symptoms, tremors, etc., that are a precursor to a formal diagnosis, and sometimes that diagnosis is a process, if you will. And so, that's something we're seeing a fair amount of. And the fact that they don't have a formal diagnosis as of yet, but they do exhibit symptoms is something that we're comfortable looking at now, even without a formal diagnosis.
We have another person asking about worker comps and hot areas, if that would help. Yeah, like we talked about earlier, I think that could be a great place to start from. And then, let's see.
I think
go ahead. As the family history, wouldn't that require a stronger warning?
My take on that, Matt, would be, you may have a different feeling, is that the family history is the family history. the warning will be an issue as to its, whether it's robust enough, regardless. And I think the case, as Matt, I think, pointed out earlier, will be more of an insufficient warning case. And there will be some things that have been seen and argued in Roundup that will probably be argued again in the Paraquat litigation. But I think the case, I think, will be centered around the insufficiency of the warning. And I think that's where that will go.
Yeah, I completely agree. Paraquat has a warning on it, obviously, but our contention is just it's not strong enough for what the links to it have been proven to be. So.
Yeah, I think that's it. So I don't see any more questions. You have access to everybody on the team here, especially Matt and myself. Our emails, I think, are readily available. If not, they're just our first name dot last name at beasleyallen.com. We will be glad to answer any questions that you have. We're very grateful that you got on today and learned more about this. We appreciate the opportunity. We know you have lots of choices out there and that your time is of value. So we very much appreciate you getting on with us today and learning more about Paraquat. If you have any questions, just let us know. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys.